Welcome. This is What's the Story podcast, your weekly podcast where we talk about life, faith, and culture. And today it's me again, Elise. I just want to stop for a moment and thank every single person who's been showing some love and DMing me saying, hey, I like your show. Thank you so much. It means the world to me. And without being said, please don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe to our channels, rate our show on Spotify. It really helps with our show. This podcast today is going to be about generational traumas and childhood experiences. We're going to explore how our past shape our future. Before we dive in, I want to note that I'm not a psychologist or a mental health expert. Everything discussed in this episode is based on research, personal understanding, and shared experiences. If you're dealing with trauma or mental health issues, consider seeking help from a licensed mental health professional. Many of us carry emotional imprints from our families. It influences who we are today and our personalities. It all influences our fears, our emotional responses, and it's all shaped by the environment our parents and families provided for us as children. This episode, we're going to explore how generational traumas can impact us and how to recognize, understand, and address them. Stay till the end, and let's get into this. Trauma. What is trauma? Trauma is a response. First of all, it's a response to deeply distressing experiences that overwhelm an individual's ability to cope. So basically, every single time when you see a similar situation or you hear a similar sound that has caused you trauma, it will deeply disturb you in that moment, or anything that triggers that memory of a traumatic event. It will all influence your ability to cope, and these events can leave lasting impacts on our emotional, our psychological, or physical well-being. Some people have been through traumatic events that have affected their physical well-being. So trauma is not limited to only physical harm, but it includes psychological impacts as well, from events that have, made your sense of security feel attacked, or your identity. There can be some types of traumas, and like the broad categories of trauma can be individual, like a personal traumatic event that you've been through. Another type is generational, which is what we're going to be talking into today. So generational trauma is a trauma that is passed down from one generation to the next. So basically, if I have a trauma, I might put that on my children, and they also have the same thing. And today we're going to be focusing on that aspect and how it affects families across generations. So generational trauma is basically an intergenerational trauma. It's passed on from one generation to the next, and it impacts family members psychologically and emotionally. And these traumas often stem from major adverse events like poverty, abuse, neglect, war, systematic oppression, experienced by ancestors. So if our ancestors have, faced atrocious situations, they can get some traumas that can be passed onto us, even when we did not necessarily live the same experiences as they lived in. It manifests through harmful behaviors, that are caused by unprocessed wounds, unprocessed emotional wounds and deep-rooted fears or beliefs. So basically, if any parent or family member has had emotional wounds and they never really got to talk about that or address it, they're able to develop a cycle of harmful behaviors that can manifest during regular day-to-day life in the family. Here are some signs of a generational trauma. When you see a recurring pattern of behaviors or mentality, this constant fear of maybe this negative pattern of maybe feeling like you fear failure, or you feel like you'll be abandoned, or you want to be a perfectionist so much, or you have self-worth struggles. If these things are like recurring patterns, there's a high chance that you have generational trauma going on. I'm not saying if you see these things in your life, that means automatically that you have trauma, generational trauma. This could be a sign, and maybe you need to consider asking yourself whether in your family there's been, some traumas. And then some family beliefs and rules. That could also be one sign of generational trauma. If there are like family rules and beliefs that are based off of there's a lack of trust, there's a lack of love, if there's like family beliefs that are, deeply ingrained in these things, that means maybe, just maybe, your family is like going through some trauma because they're like, we don't trust that it will be fine. We don't trust that, everything will be just fine as you walk out of that door. Some curfews that are put on in some families, maybe, just maybe. And then there's also like one other big sign. I think people don't notice, but there's emotional triggers. When someone reacts, but reacts so intense to some certain situations, like they're so defensive, like overly defensive, or like they're overly cautious in relationships, it can be signs of unresolved trauma. Like when you feel like your emotions, when you react in an intense way, like you overreact everything, maybe there's like some emotional triggers that are caused by generational trauma. So these are a few signs. And then lastly, another sign of generational trauma is having health issues and the way your brain has its coping mechanism. Health issues and coping mechanisms. This can be a sign of generational trauma if a person is going through anxiety or depression. Physical health issues can also sometimes be a sign of unresolved generational trauma. But obviously that can only be proved by a health professional. And then substance abuse. I think this is a big one. Some people will find a way to numb the pain by just going into drugs and over drinking alcohol because it's painful. They're feeling pain. They don't even know where that pain is coming from, and they just want to, find an escape. So substance abuse can also be one way of, coping. It can be a coping mechanism, and yeah, it can be a sign of generational trauma. So generational trauma can stem from, emotional neglect or abuse, when a child is crying and they just neglect him, like, oh, he'll be fine. He's just whining, That can be emotional neglect. Children, when they're developing, their emotions are also developing, and not all emotions of children should be cared for, but we need to be careful that we don't cause emotional neglect in their life. because that can cause a trauma in them, and it harms the way their brain develops. So from the age of 2 to 5, that's when like a child's emotional well-being is developing. We need to be careful that we don't neglect their emotions, because it affects the way they grow. And some children have grown up in homes where there has been abuse. So maybe you had like a step parent, or your guardians did not treat you the same way as their own children. Maybe you grew up in a family home where there was not necessarily your parents. So abuse can also be one thing that can cause generational trauma. And it often results in a lack of self-worth in relationships. It can result in people pleasing, because it's like, I really have to make sure these people like me, otherwise they're going to chase me away from their home, and you tend to put that people pleasing in other relationships, and you have a difficulty setting boundaries. Those are all results of, emotional neglect and abuse. Generational trauma can also be rooted in financial and economic hardships, where family members have a belief system around scarcity and insecurity that is never going to be enough. There's never going to be financial stability. This can create a fear-based mindset about money and success. And it all comes back to like that generational trauma of like, when I grew up, there was no money. There was economic hardship. Like the finances were zero. Now I'm going to raise my children to know that there's always scarcity and insecurity and financial instability. And this is something that happens in the subconscious mind. You don't even know that you have this thing. That's how dangerous these things can be. We need to be careful and have self-reflection every single time to make sure that we deal with these things. And one other big thing that can cause generational trauma is grief and loss, especially when it's unresolved. When some families have to deal with losing a loved one, maybe going through atrocious wars, it can always result into unresolved grief, especially when we avoid vulnerability, when we avoid talking about these things. It just causes emotional isolation, and these things can be passed down through generations. So what are the effects of generational traumas on our lives and future children? Number 1, it impacts our relationships. Without addressing these traumas, it is common that you will have very toxic relationships, romantic relationships, before you even get into marriage. And you will keep repeating these harmful patterns in your relationships. It will affect your intimacy, it will affect your trust, it will affect your communication, basically everything about relationships. And then secondly, it can increase the risk of mental health issues like anxiety, depression, or even physical health issues like weak immune systems, hypertension. This can all be because of chronic stress. And then thirdly, it affects our parenting styles. The way I grow up to parent my children will be a result of how I was raised. So if I was raised in an environment where there was trauma, there's a high chance I'll also raise my children in an environment that has trauma. That's how dangerous this is. And I think I remember watching this show one day, and the mother had a child who was raped, but when the child came home and told the mom that she was raped, the mom just said, "Oh, okay," and then she just went. Then she never got to address anything. Like, did you get any pregnancy? Did you get any STD? Should we go to the police? Who did this? None of that. she just left the room. And the child was left to like deal with that alone. Like, what? Isn't this my mom? Isn't she supposed to like care that I've been raped? And on the show, so the mother and daughter were both there, and the mother said, I don't know how to deal with that because I also have things I'm struggling with that I also don't know how to deal with. It's like she doesn't know how to deal with a problem like that because herself, she's been raped, and no one, absolutely no one helped her when she was younger and she was raped. So now, when her daughter has to go through rape, she doesn't know how to deal with it. So it affects your parenting styles. And then you always have limiting beliefs, You always have like, you cannot take risks. You just don't know if these people will, still love you the same way. It affects the way your career success, because it's like, there's not enough money. I cannot go, take this path. There's always like, you have a fear of like taking risks and pursuing your passions, because it's like, I don't know how we will go. You just don't want to take a risk and risk it all. It affects the way you live your life, basically. And now, how do we heal from these things? How do we break the cycle? I hope at this point, if you've noticed that you've struggled with any of these things, I hope at this point you want to break the cycle. I hope you don't want this to continue into the next generation. I hope you want your children to grow up and not have to carry the broken pieces because their mom or dad didn't really care. You need to be self-aware. You need to recognize and accept these patterns and emotions. Don't run away from them. Face it and deal with it. You need to acknowledge that it comes from generational trauma, and how can we deal with it? And maybe you were even born in an environment where there has been like healthy relationships, no trauma, but over the course of your life, you've been going through things and it's giving you trauma. How can you now deal with that before you get into marriage and relationships and children? Because you don't want to take that. You don't want to be the beginning of the cycle. Maybe you need to seek therapy. Maybe you need to start working with a counselor, especially who understands trauma, because this is essential. There are many approaches, different types of therapy that are helpful to help you deal with trauma. And the thing is, I'm not perfect. I'm also speaking to myself. That's the thing. With these things, I also need to work on some things, I'm not perfect by no means. So this is a shared experience. And then you need to practice some mindfulness and meditation. You need to practice emotional regulation every single time when you feel something. Because with emotions, we can feel them. If you're angry, you feel that you're angry. You really feel it, and you can feel it coming. With anxiety, with depression, you can feel it in your head that you're not okay. You need to practice emotional regulation. Maybe you need to pause and stay present. Maybe you need to stop and take a deep breath. It will help disrupt the old patterns of going through the same cycle of emotional trauma. And then seek some support groups. Maybe you need to form one in your area of people who have gone through similar experiences. There are very different support groups available already. Or you just need to seek out support and be like, hey, I'm struggling, I need help. You're not meant to struggle alone. Reach out. There's so many free resources online. Others are paid for those who are able to afford it, but seek help. Reach out to someone. It can be empowering to share experiences with others, and it helps you feel less isolated and know that you're not alone in this, and you're not the first one who's been through these hard things. Because sometimes it could also be one thing. The biggest thing can be, I know what I've been through, nobody else can understand, so I'll just keep it to myself, because even if they listen, they'll not be able to help. That could be one thing. You need to break down that wall and know that you're not the only one who struggled. There are millions other people on the other side who are also struggling. And when you know that and hear their story, you'll know that you're not alone. You need to also practice healthy communication and setting boundaries with your family members, because it affects how you feel and it will affect your future and the way you do your life. So maybe you need to move out of your home if you can't afford it. Maybe you need to tell your family members, hey, these behaviors and these practices, they affect the way I feel and this needs to stop. Maybe you're the one who is going to start these conversations, these hard conversations with your parents, and be like, hey, we need to talk. Like, some things need to change in this household. And then have some self-compassion, I love to call this reparenting. Maybe we need to reparent ourselves and show some love and kindness where we may not have received it growing up. If you need to buy yourself that good item, if you need to take yourself out and, spend money on you, buy that expensive perfume for you, if you need to put on that good piece of outfit, that good piece of, if you want to buy that expensive jacket for you, you need to go ahead and do it. Show yourself some love. I think I heard someone say, don't be stingy when it comes to you. Of course, don't go over budget and overspending your whole savings and monthly income in one go. But it's like, sometimes if it's that expensive jewelry, buy it, because it's for you. When it comes to you, show yourself some love and some compassion. If you need to take a day off, shut off all devices just for you, be alone in your house, do some self-care, maybe read a book. If you need to take 2 hours of rest, take a nap, cook yourself some good food for you, go ahead and do it, because you need to recharge and refresh for the next day. As we wrap up, it's very important that we break the cycle. I'm not saying it's easy, by no means, but the benefit ripples outwards. It influences not just ourselves, but future generations. By addressing and, acknowledging these problems, we will heal those wounds. We will create healthier, more resilient foundations for our children and transform the emotional legacy we pass on. Reflect on any patterns in your own family or life. Seek support if you need to, and identify those areas that need healing and deal with them. Until next week, peace, love, and light.